This story is about family betrayal, public humiliation, and the moment a daughter finally chooses self-respect over silent suffering. And my name is Emily Carter, and the night it all finally broke happened at my younger sister's wedding, when an usher looked at my place card, frowned, and said quietly but clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I'm sorry, you're not seated inside. You'll be in the hallway." And before I could even process that, my sister leaned over in her white dress, smiling for photos, and whispered, "Don't make a scene, Emily. This day isn't about you." And that single sentence landed harder than anything she'd ever said to me before, because it confirmed what I'd spent my whole life trying not to believe, that no matter how much I endured, I would always be an afterthought in my own family. I stood there frozen, clutching the small gift bag I'd paid for myself because my parents said they forgot to include me in the family contribution, and I could feel eyes on me as guests walked past into the decorated ballroom with its soft music and candlelight, while I was directed toward a narrow carpeted hallway near the restrooms, where a folding chair and a tiny round table sat awkwardly against the wall like an after-party joke that had gone too far. As I sat down, the door to the ballroom swung open and I could hear laughter, clinking glasses, and my father's booming voice giving a toast about family unity, and how proud we are of our daughters. And I remember thinking how strange it was that he could say daughters plural when he hadn't looked at me all evening. The humiliation wasn't just the chair or the hallway, it was the ease with which everyone accepted it, including my own mother, who walked past me at one point, paused, and said in a low voice, "Emily, please don't start anything today. Just be grateful you were invited." As if my presence itself was a favor they had extended rather than a basic act of decency. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat and tell myself I could get through one more family event the way I always had, quietly, politely, invisibly. But then my sister's maid of honor, one of our cousins, walked by and laughed nervously, saying, "Wow, they really put you out here?" before hurrying inside, and something inside me finally cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt permanent, like a door closing behind me. As I sat there listening to speeches I wasn't allowed to see, memories started flooding in uninvited, each one stacking on top of the other until the weight became unbearable. Memories of birthdays where my cake came from the grocery store bakery, while my sister's parties had planners and themes. Memories of college acceptance letters where my parents told me, "You're strong, you'll figure it out," while they emptied savings accounts for her tuition without hesitation. Memories of family dinners where my achievements were met with polite nods, while my sister's minor inconveniences became urgent crises everyone rushed to solve. Sitting in that hallway, I realized this wedding wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was simply the most public version of a pattern that had defined my entire life. And the worst part was that I had helped maintain it by staying quiet, by minimizing my hurt, by telling myself that being the easy daughter was a virtue rather than a survival strategy. I remember looking down at my phone and seeing a message from my mother sent just minutes earlier that read, "Please don't embarrass us tonight." And something about the word "us" made my chest ache, because it made it clear that I was not included in that collective, that I was a liability to be managed rather than a daughter to be protected. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and cheap flowers, and the chair beneath me wobbled slightly every time I shifted my weight, and I thought about how symbolic it all was, how I had been given just enough space to exist without ever truly belonging, and for the first time, instead of shrinking, I let myself feel angry, not explosive anger, but a quiet, steady resolve that settled deep in my bones. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and for a moment I hesitated, wondering if leaving would finally confirm everything they thought about me, that I was dramatic, selfish, ungrateful. But then I remembered my sister's whisper, the way she hadn't even looked remorseful, just annoyed, and I realized that no matter what I did, I would always be wrong in their eyes, so I might as well be wrong on my own terms. As I walked toward the exit, a distant cheer erupted from the ballroom, probably marking the couple's first dance. And I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief wash over me. Sadness for the family I'd never truly had, and relief that I was finally stepping out of the role they had assigned me. When I reached the door, my father called my name sharply. "Emily, where are you going?" And I turned back just long enough to meet his gaze and say calmly, "I'm leaving. I don't belong here." And instead of stopping me, instead of apologizing or even pretending to care, he sighed and said, "Don't be so sensitive." And that was the moment I knew with absolute clarity that walking out of that hallway wasn't just leaving a wedding, it was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change the way my family saw me forever, whether they liked it or not. By the time I reached my car that night, my hands were shaking, Not from the cold but from the realization that this moment at the wedding hallway was only the sharpest edge of a lifetime of smaller cuts. And to understand why it hurt the way it did, you need to understand the family I came from and the role I was assigned in it long before my sister ever put on a white dress. Growing up, it was always understood, never openly said but clearly demonstrated, that my younger sister Lauren was the center of gravity in our household, the one whose feelings mattered most, whose mistakes were forgiven before they were even acknowledged, whose needs reshaped everyone else's plans, while I was the daughter expected to adapt, to compromise, to be mature. A phrase my parents used so often it became synonymous with silence. When we were kids, if Lauren cried, dinner stopped. If I cried, I was told to calm down and stop overreacting. At school events, my parents sat front and center for her recitals and games, cheering loudly, taking photos, posting proudly, while my achievements, honor roll certificates, debate trophies, even my college graduation, were met with distracted smiles and comments like, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation drifted back to Lauren's latest drama. I learned early that praise was scarce currency in our family, and that the easiest way to survive was to stop expecting it, to become low maintenance, the daughter who never asked for much and therefore never disappointed anyone by wanting more. That pattern followed us into adulthood, hardening into something uglier as responsibilities and money entered the picture, because favoritism that feels hurtful when you're young becomes damaging when it shapes real-life consequences. When Lauren decided to go to an expensive private college out of state, my parents drained a large portion of their savings without hesitation, telling me proudly that family supports family. But when I later asked for modest help with my own tuition at a state university, my father sighed and said, "You're independent, Emily. You'll figure it out." As if independence were an innate trait rather than a role I'd been forced to play. I worked 2 jobs through school, took out loans, lived with roommates, and told myself it was fine, that struggling was character building, while Lauren studied abroad, changed majors twice, and called home whenever life felt overwhelming, confident that someone would catch her before she fell. Family gatherings followed the same script every time. Lauren's relationship problems became group discussions everyone weighed in on, while my work stress or personal milestones were brushed aside as less interesting, less urgent, less worthy of attention. Even when I tried, gently at first, to express how this imbalance made me feel, my mother would frown and say, "We don't love her more, she just needs us more." A sentence that placed the burden squarely on me to need less, to want less, to expect less, until I internalized the idea that being easy to ignore was somehow virtuous. The emotional neglect wasn't loud or dramatic, which almost made it worse, because there was no single incident I could point to and say, "This is when they failed me." Instead, it was death by 1,000 quiet dismissals, each one small enough to excuse, but together forming a pattern that shaped how I saw myself and my place in the world. When Lauren got engaged, the imbalance intensified in ways I hadn't anticipated, because weddings have a way of exposing family priorities with brutal clarity. From the moment she announced the engagement, everything revolved around her plans, her stress, her vision, and my parents dove in eagerly, offering financial help, logistical support, and endless emotional reassurance, while I was expected to be endlessly available but emotionally invisible, helping where asked but never centering myself. I remember offering to help with planning, only to be told by Lauren, half joking but not really, "I don't want you stressing me out," a comment my parents laughed off instead of questioning, and I swallowed the familiar sting and stayed quiet. Invitations went out, seating charts were finalized, fittings were scheduled, and at no point did anyone ask me how I felt or what I needed, as if my role was already decided and required no consultation. The night before the wedding, I overheard my parents talking about last-minute expenses they were covering for Lauren, my father remarking that it was worth it to make sure everything is perfect for her, and I remember standing in the hallway outside their bedroom, feeling invisible in my own childhood home, realizing that perfection had always been reserved for one daughter, while adequacy was deemed good enough for the other. Looking back, the hallway seat at the wedding wasn't a shocking deviation from how I'd been treated. It was simply the first time the hierarchy was displayed so openly, in front of friends, extended family, and strangers, and that public exposure stripped away the last of my excuses, the last of my rationalizations. Sitting alone outside that ballroom, listening to my family celebrate togetherness without me, I was forced to confront the truth I'd been avoiding for years, that the neglect wasn't accidental, that the favoritism wasn't situational, and that no amount of patience or understanding on my part was ever going to earn me a place I wasn't meant to have. That realization hurt deeply, but it also planted the first seed of something new, something dangerous to the old family dynamic. A quiet understanding that if I continued to accept this treatment, I would be complicit in my own erasure, and that for the first time in my life, staying silent was no longer an option I could live with. The days after the wedding should have been quiet, maybe awkward but temporary, yet instead they unfolded like a slow, deliberate escalation, as if my family, rather than reflecting on what had happened, decided to double down and make my discomfort feel justified. The morning after I left, my phone lit up not with concern, but with irritation, a text from my mother reading, "Your behavior last night really upset your father. People noticed you weren't there," followed minutes later by another message from Lauren that said, "I hope you're happy. You made my wedding about you." And I remember staring at those words in disbelief, because somehow my absence from a hallway chair had become a greater offense than the fact that I'd been placed there in the first place. When I tried to explain, carefully choosing my words the way I always had, telling my mother that being seated outside the ballroom had been humiliating and hurtful, she interrupted me on the phone and said sharply, "Emily, that's not what happened. You're exaggerating." And in that moment I felt that familiar sensation of reality being quietly rewritten. My experience smoothed over and reshaped until it fit the version of events that required the least accountability from anyone else. Within days, extended family members started reaching out, not to ask how I was, but to gently suggest that I apologize to Lauren to keep the peace, a phrase that had always meant sacrificing my feelings so that everyone else could remain comfortable. One aunt even said, "You know how sensitive your sister is," as if sensitivity were an exclusive trait that justified public disrespect. And as I listened, I realized that the narrative was already being spread. That I was dramatic, jealous, unstable, the difficult daughter who couldn't just let her sister have one perfect day. What hurt most was how coordinated it all felt, how seamlessly my parents and sister slipped into the roles they knew so well, minimizing my pain while amplifying her disappointment, turning a clear act of exclusion into a story of my supposed ingratitude. The humiliation didn't stay private for long either, because at the next family gathering, a small post-wedding brunch hosted by my parents, the hallway seat became a punchline disguised as humor, my father laughing and saying, "Well, next time we'll make sure Emily gets a VIP spot," while others chuckled uncomfortably, and I sat there smiling tightly, feeling like I was watching myself from outside my body. Lauren didn't look at me once during that meal, but I could feel her irritation like a physical presence. And when she finally spoke to me, it was only to say, "I really don't understand why you couldn't just sit where you were told," her tone implying that obedience should have outweighed self-respect. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. That my family wasn't just dismissive of my feelings, they actively relied on my compliance to maintain the version of themselves they wanted to believe in, and my refusal to quietly accept humiliation threatened that fragile balance. The manipulation became more subtle after that. Wrapped in concern rather than criticism, my mother calling to ask if I was okay, only to follow it with suggestions that therapy might help me process my jealousy, as if the problem lay in my emotional response rather than the behavior that triggered it. I started to notice how often my words were twisted or selectively remembered, how statements like "I felt hurt" were later repeated back to me as Emily was angry and caused a scene, and each distortion chipped away at my trust, making me question not just my family, but the safety of speaking honestly at all. At work and with friends, I was the calm, competent version of myself everyone relied on, but inside I was unraveling, replaying conversations, wondering how something so plainly wrong could be so easily dismissed by the people who were supposed to care the most. The breaking point came when I learned, almost by accident, that my parents had told several relatives that I had refused my assigned seat out of spite and jealousy, that I had stormed out dramatically, and that they had been deeply embarrassed by my behavior. And hearing my own actions described that way felt like being erased and replaced by a caricature I didn't recognize. I confronted my mother about it, my voice steady but my hands trembling, and she responded with a weary sigh and said, "Emily, we can't control how people interpret things," even though she was the one doing the interpreting, the one shaping the story to protect everyone but me. For the first time I stopped trying to argue, stopped trying to convince her of my perspective, because I could see how futile it was, how every attempt at honesty was simply being used as raw material for further manipulation. The injustice of it all settled heavily on me, not in a burst of anger but in a deep, aching clarity. My family had no intention of acknowledging the harm they'd caused, and as long as I stayed within the system they'd built, I would continue to be blamed for reacting to wounds they refused to see. That realization left me feeling cornered, isolated, and profoundly tired, but beneath that exhaustion, something else was beginning to form, something quiet and dangerous to the old order, a growing awareness that if my family was willing to rewrite reality so easily, then the only way to protect myself was to stop relying on their version of events entirely and start anchoring myself in truth I could prove. Once that clarity settled in, once I accepted that my family's version of events would never include my truth unless it served them, something in me shifted from hurt to intention, and I began to move through my days differently, more observant, less reactive, quietly attentive in a way I'd never needed to be before. I stopped engaging in circular arguments and emotional explanations that only seemed to give them more material to twist, and instead I started paying close attention to patterns, to inconsistencies, to the small details that revealed far more than their carefully chosen words ever did. It wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense, not yet, but about grounding myself in something solid because I realized that if I wanted to protect my dignity and my future, I needed more than feelings. I needed facts, timelines, and clarity. I began by revisiting old messages, scrolling back through years of family group chats and private texts, noticing how often plans were made without me, how frequently my contributions were acknowledged only in passing, how decisions that affected me were framed as already finalized, and seeing it all laid out like that was both painful and strangely validating, because it confirmed that what I'd felt for so long wasn't imagined. I started saving screenshots, not with the intention of confronting anyone immediately, but as a way of reminding myself that my memory was trustworthy, that I hadn't invented the imbalance or the exclusion. Around the same time, I learned through a casual comment from my mother that my parents had been discussing financial adjustments, now that Lauren was married, and the phrase caught my attention because money had always been where favoritism turned from emotional to tangible. I asked a few neutral questions, carefully phrased, and what emerged over the following weeks was a picture that left me stunned. My parents had been quietly planning to transfer ownership of a small rental property they owned, an asset I'd always assumed would be divided or at least discussed someday, entirely to Lauren and her new husband as a wedding gift, without ever mentioning it to me. When I pressed gently, my father shrugged and said, "You don't need it, Emily. You're doing fine." A sentence that echoed painfully with every year independent I'd ever been told, and for the first time, I saw clearly how my self-sufficiency had been used not as something to be proud of, but as justification for being consistently overlooked. Instead of reacting emotionally, I did something new. I listened, I asked follow-up questions, and I documented everything, noting dates, statements, and the casual ease with which decisions about shared family assets were being made without transparency. I consulted a financial advisor under the guise of planning my own future, and in those conversations, I learned more about inheritance laws, property rights, and the legal expectations around asset transfers than I ever thought I'd need to know. And each piece of information added another layer of calm resolve rather than fear. At the same time, I began setting quiet boundaries in my personal life, pulling back from being endlessly available, declining last-minute requests framed as obligations, and noticing how quickly concern turned into irritation when I was no longer so easily accessible, which only confirmed how much my compliance had been taken for granted. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I was overthinking, if this level of preparation was unnecessary, but then I'd remember the hallway chair, the rewritten narratives, the ease with which my absence had been framed as betrayal, and the doubt would recede, replaced by a steady conviction that protecting myself was not an act of aggression, but of self-respect. I also began speaking to a lawyer not to initiate conflict but to understand my rights and options, to learn what was fair versus what was merely traditional or assumed, and those conversations were quietly empowering because for the first time I was operating with knowledge rather than hope. The lawyer listened without judgment as I described my family dynamic, the wedding incident, the planned property transfer, and when I finished she said simply, "You're not wrong to feel concerned. These are significant decisions that affect you." And hearing that from a neutral authority felt like a hand on my back, steadying me. As weeks turned into months, I continued this quiet preparation, never announcing it, never hinting at what I was learning, letting my family believe that the tension would eventually fade as it always had, while beneath the surface, I was building something they didn't expect. A foundation of evidence, understanding, and self-trust that no amount of dismissal could shake. By the time my parents announced a family meeting to discuss future plans, I walked into that conversation not as the overlooked daughter hoping to be heard, but as a woman who finally understood the power of silence paired with preparation, and who was ready when the moment came to let the truth speak for itself. The family meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house, framed casually as a chance to get everyone on the same page. But the moment I walked into the living room and saw Lauren and her husband already seated beside my parents, their posture relaxed and confident, I knew decisions had already been made, and that this was less a discussion than a formality meant to secure my quiet acceptance. My father cleared his throat and began speaking about the importance of planning for the future, about how proud he was of both his daughters, words that felt rehearsed and hollow, before casually announcing that they had decided to transfer full ownership of the rental property to Lauren as a wedding gift and an investment in her new life, saying it as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. There it was, laid out plainly, the culmination of years of imbalance, and for a brief moment the old reflex kicked in, the instinct to swallow my feelings and nod along. But instead I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you're finally prepared. I asked a few measured questions about the timeline, the valuation of the property, and whether any legal counsel had been involved, and my mother smiled tightly and said, "Emily, this isn't about numbers, it's about family," a familiar deflection that no longer worked on me. When I mentioned that I'd spoken to a lawyer to better understand how such transfers typically work, the room shifted instantly, Lauren stiffening, my father's expression hardening as he asked sharply, "Why would you do that?" And I answered honestly, "Because these decisions affect me too," a sentence I'd never been able to say without guilt before. The tension escalated quickly, voices rising as my parents accused me of being distrustful and creating unnecessary conflict, Lauren insisting tearfully that I was trying to ruin her happiness again, and it was then that I did something that changed the entire dynamic. I calmly told them that my lawyer would be joining us shortly, because I wanted the discussion to be clear, factual, and fair. The doorbell rang not long after, and when the attorney stepped into the room, professional and composed, the emotional chaos abruptly lost its power, because suddenly this wasn't a family squabble that could be dismissed or rewritten, it was a conversation with legal weight. She introduced herself, explained her role, and asked my parents to walk through their plan, gently but firmly clarifying points they glossed over, such as whether the property had been purchased during the marriage, how its value factored into their overall estate, and whether there was any documentation outlining intentions for both daughters. As she spoke, I watched my parents' confidence falter, watched them realize that the assumptions they'd relied on for years didn't hold up under scrutiny. And when the lawyer pointed out that transferring the property entirely to one daughter without consideration or documentation could lead to serious legal challenges later, the room fell into a stunned silence. Lauren looked between her husband and my parents, her certainty wavering as the implications sank in, and for the first time, I wasn't the unreasonable one in the room, I was simply the one asking for clarity. The lawyer then laid out several options, including fair valuation, transparent documentation, and alternative arrangements that didn't leave one daughter entirely excluded. And hearing those possibilities spoken aloud by an authority figure felt like watching the power shift in real time. My father tried to regain control, insisting they were free to do what they wanted with their assets, and the lawyer nodded calmly and said, "Of course you are, but choices have consequences and it's important everyone understands them," a statement that reframed the entire conversation. What shocked everyone most wasn't anger or confrontation, but my composure, the way I spoke evenly about wanting fairness rather than favors, about how the wedding incident and the hallway seat were part of a larger pattern of exclusion that had finally forced me to protect myself, and as I spoke, I could see realization dawning on the faces of extended family members who had joined the call remotely, hearing this fuller context for the first time. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been finalized, but everything had changed, because the truth was no longer something my family could dismiss or reshape. It was documented, acknowledged, and understood by someone outside our insular dynamic, and as the lawyer gathered her things and left, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief, knowing that the confrontation I'd feared for so long hadn't destroyed me, but had instead stripped away the illusion that I was powerless, leaving behind a quiet, undeniable shift that my family could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed that meeting, the noise settled into something quieter and more honest, and for the first time in my life I wasn't waiting for my family to decide how things would turn out, because the outcome was no longer something happening to me, it was something I was actively shaping. The property transfer was paused, paperwork suspended while my parents were forced to confront realities they'd avoided for years, And although there were tense conversations and moments of defensiveness, there was also something new in the air, a reluctance to dismiss me outright now that my concerns had been validated by someone they couldn't brush aside. My parents, faced with legal clarity and the prospect of long-term consequences, agreed to a revised estate plan that acknowledged both daughters transparently, not out of sudden fairness perhaps, but because the old dynamic could no longer function under scrutiny. Lauren's behavior shifted as well, the confidence she'd once worn so easily giving way to a cautious distance, and while she never apologized for the hallway seat or the way I'd been treated, she stopped framing me as the problem, which in our family was its own kind of acknowledgement. What surprised me most wasn't their change though, but my own, because somewhere along the way I'd stopped needing their validation to feel whole, and that shift altered everything. I no longer jumped to respond to every message or smoothed over discomfort to keep the peace, and instead I chose when and how to engage, setting boundaries that felt firm but fair, and watching as my parents slowly adjusted to a version of me they couldn't control with guilt or dismissal. The wedding hallway, once a source of shame, became a turning point I could look back on with clarity rather than pain, because it marked the moment I finally stood up and walked away from a role that had never served me. There were still moments of grief, still times when I mourned the family dynamic I wished I'd had, but those feelings no longer defined me, because I understood now that respect wasn't something you earned by enduring neglect, it was something you claimed by refusing to accept it. Friends noticed the change, commenting on how grounded I seemed, how calm, and I realized that the strength I'd built quietly over years of being overlooked had finally found its purpose, not in proving anyone wrong, but in choosing myself without apology. Looking back, I don't see the wedding as the day I was humiliated, but as the day the truth became impossible to ignore, when a hallway chair revealed more about my family than any argument ever could, and gave me the clarity I needed to step into my own life fully. I didn't need revenge or public vindication or dramatic confrontations beyond that one necessary moment, because the real victory was internal, the freedom that came from knowing my worth and protecting it fiercely, even when the people who should have done so failed to. I still attend family gatherings, but on my terms now, with boundaries that make my presence a choice rather than an obligation, and whether my family ever fully understands the shift doesn't matter as much as the fact that I do, because I no longer measure my value by where I'm seated or how quietly I endure, but by the respect I demand and the life I build beyond the hallway they once tried to confine me to. Friends, if you liked our story, then be sure to like and comment on the video, and to watch such story videos, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you will receive our new content every day.